Imagine a government, right, just sending massive heavy-duty bulldozers into a densely populated neighborhood.
Right.
And they just start tearing down homes and, completely clearing out these informal settlements.
A striking image, yeah.
It really is. And usually, I mean, when we see an image like that on the news or wherever, we interpret it as a tragedy or perhaps like a brutal act of oppression against the poor, right?
Absolutely. That's the default reaction.
Yeah, but what if, and this is a big what if, you viewed those bulldozers not as like instruments of punishment, but as the mandatory first step in a master plan, like a master plan to build a trillion-dollar economy? What if tearing up that ground was literally the only way to pour a foundation strong enough to save a nation from, well, just collapsing in on itself?
That is exactly the premise we're looking at today.
Right. So today we are unpacking a roadmap for the future of Nepal. And it's a roadmap that demands that exact, uncompromising level of pragmatic ruthlessness. So welcome to this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks. We're dissecting a highly provocative, deeply layered blog post today.
Very provocative.
Extremely. It was published in May 2026 by a source known as Democracy for Nepal. And essentially, the author is attempting to draft this comprehensive blueprint for Nepal's political and economic survival.
And they do it in a really fascinating way, don't they?
They do. They thread together three seemingly separate things. So you've got the intense street-level urban renewal happening right now in Kathmandu.
Right.
Then they connect that to the recent incredibly rapid industrial transformation of the Indian state of Uttar Pradesh.
Which is a huge leap right off the bat.
It is. And then, as if that's not enough, they tie both of those to the legendary 20th century social engineering of Singapore under Lee Kuan Yew.
Yeah. And, to really grasp the scale of what we are dealing with today, for you listening, you have to understand the mind behind this source text. Because this is not, your standard run-of-the-mill political commentary.
No, not at all.
Right. This post sits inside an enormous, incredibly eclectic bibliography. I mean, the author has written extensively on artificial intelligence, biotechnology, marketing theories, global uprisings.
It's a wild mix of topics.
It really is. And even something called Kalkiism.
Right, the Kalkiism stuff.
Yeah, which is this concept tying the apocalyptic cyclical nature of time in Hindu theology to modern global shifts. So, I mean, this is a big picture thinker. Someone who synthesizes vast, disparate disciplines to form a singular and, let's be honest, highly aggressive worldview.
Aggressive is the perfect word for it, because we are navigating a text that effortlessly jumps from, local municipal disputes in the Himalayas all the way to the highest echelons of global macroeconomic theory.
Yeah.
And it's a text that pulls absolutely no punches. I mean, it contains brutal critiques of Nepal's current democratic frameworks. It hurls severe insults at specific politicians.
So we'll get to the insults. They are intense.
Very intense. And it openly champions strategies that, well, many would just flat out categorize as soft authoritarianism.
Which brings us to a really vital disclaimer before we go any further into the weeds here.
Yeah, this is important.
So to you, the listener, we are going to explore some highly opinionated, heavily polarized, and politically charged territory today. And we are not here to endorse the author's vision.
Exactly. Nor are we here to condemn it.
Right. Our mission is strictly analytical. We are just your guides, taking you through the specific arguments, the historical mechanisms, and the underlying logic the author uses to build their case. Nothing more.
Perfectly said. And really, the central tension driving this entire text is a complete rejection of theory in favor of aesthetics and absolute control.
Aesthetics and control. Tell me more about that.
Well, the argument posits that building a beautiful city and enforcing the absolute rule of law are not just, pleasant byproducts of a good government.
Right, like a nice to have.
Exactly. It's not a nice to have. The author argues they are the critical engines of national survival. They matter infinitely more than whatever political ideology a nation claims to hold, whether that's multi-party democracy, republicanism, federalism. None of it matters without aesthetics and control.
So let's pull on that thread of rejecting ideologies, because the author uses some very heavy specific language right out of the gate.
Yeah, they do.
They declare that multi-party democracy, republicanism, and federalism in Nepal are imported and stale.
Right. Imported and stale.
Which is such a specific phrasing. Calling a system like federalism imported, to me, suggests it was basically like an operating system downloaded from a Western server and forced onto a hard drive that wasn't built to run it.
That's a great analogy. It's an OS incompatibility issue.
Right. But then calling it stale implies something even worse. It implies that the very promise of these ideologies has just rotted away over time.
Yeah, and the concept of scaleness here refers to the disconnect between political slogans and material reality. Because, over the past few decades, Nepal has undergone immense political upheaval.
Huge shifts.
Right, transitioning from a monarchy to a federal republic. Yet, the author observes that despite these grand theoretical victories, the daily lived experience of the average citizen has barely improved.
They're still dealing with the same old stuff.
Exactly. Poor infrastructure, stagnant economic growth, pervasive corruption. The political vocabulary evolved, they learned the new words, but the material conditions completely stagnated.
And the text contrasts this failure of stale ideologies with what it calls the authentic demand of Generation Z.
Yes.
And they define that demand as something completely unprecedented for the region, which is just a corruption-free nation.
Right.
Now, on the surface, demanding an end to corruption sounds like, well, the most generic political promise imaginable.
Yeah, literally every politician in history has promised to fight corruption.
Exactly. But the author frames this as a radical, revolutionary pivot. So I have to ask, why does the author frame basic anti-corruption as something unprecedented or authentic compared to established systems like a republic?
It's a really interesting point. It's radical because it abandons the traditional ideological spectrum entirely. Generation Z, in this framing, they aren't asking for more socialism or, more free market capitalism.
They don't care about the branding.
Right, exactly. They are demanding outcome-based governance. They are demanding that the state function as a machine that actually delivers tangible results rather than just acting as a theater for political debate.
Ah, okay.
So a corruption-free nation isn't viewed as a policy goal. It's viewed as a structural reset of the entire social contract.
So they just want the computer to stop crashing, essentially.
Precisely. Just make the machine work.
Okay, but if outcome-based governance is the ultimate goal, you have to prove it actually works outside of a theoretical vacuum. You can't just talk about it.
Right, you need evidence.
And the author knows this, so they point straight across the southern border to a massive, real-world case study. And that is the Indian state of Uttar Pradesh, commonly known as UP, under the leadership of Yogi Adityanath.
Right. And Uttar Pradesh provides a critical sense of scale for the author's argument, because we are talking about a state with a population exceeding 200 million people.
200 million? That's practically a country on its own.
It would be one of the largest countries in the world.
Yeah.
And historically, UP was burdened with immense challenges: severe poverty, systemic underdevelopment, and frankly, a notorious reputation for organized crime and lawlessness.
Yeah.
But the text uses UP to demonstrate that even a region of staggering size and complexity like that can undergo a visible, dramatic turnaround in less than a decade.
In less than 10 years.
Yeah.
Which is wild. And the catalyst for that turnaround, according to the source, was a singular, uncompromising focus on establishing law and order. The author argues that cleaning up the streets led directly to Yogi Adityanath's re-election and put Uttar Pradesh on a trajectory to become what the text boldly labels India's Germany.
India's Germany. It's a huge claim.
It is. And let's pause and dissect that leap in logic because it's a big one. We were jumping straight from, putting more police on the street to suddenly churning out industrial powerhouses, car factories, and massive economic development.
Yeah, it sounds disconnected at first.
Right. How does cracking down on local mafias mechanically translate to the economic output of a European powerhouse? Like, what's the link there?
Okay, so the mechanism connecting police action to industrial booms relies on the nature of capital flow. Capital, whether it's foreign direct investment, domestic corporate expansion, international venture funding, whatever capital is profoundly risk-averse.
Right. Nobody wants to lose money.
Exactly. Now, multinational corporations might tolerate a chaotic environment if they are merely extracting a rare natural resource, right, like oil or minerals.
Because the payoff is so huge.
Yeah. Right. The profit margins justify hiring a private security force to guard the mine. But building an industrial base, establishing complex supply chains, and constructing manufacturing hubs, that requires systemic stability.
Oh, I see. Because you can't run a precise, just-in-time manufacturing supply chain if your delivery trucks are constantly being stopped by local gangs demanding extortion money.
Exactly. If the local bureaucracy is entirely corrupt, the sheer friction of doing business just drives the investment to a different state. Or a different country entirely.
Yeah, they'll just go somewhere easier.
Which is why the text equates law and order with the foundational soil necessary for an economy to grow. By neutralizing organized crime and enforcing the law relentlessly, UP signaled to risk-averse capital that their investments would be secure.
So the security is the prerequisite.
Absolutely. The author's thesis is that once the threat of extortion and chaos is removed, the sheer demographic weight and potential of a place like UP naturally attracts the massive industrial investments required to emulate a manufacturing giant like Germany.
That makes a lot of sense. So, having established that a ruthless focus on security can rapidly transform a region as massive as UP, the author looks for the individual capable of triggering that exact same catalytic process back home in Nepal.
Right, they need their own catalyst.
Yeah, and the text points to the streets of Kathmandu and zeroes in on its current mayor, Balen Shah.
And the endorsement in the text is absolute. I mean, the author explicitly views Balen Shah as possessing the greatest potential to become prime minister out of all the political figures they've observed in their lifetime.
Wow, that's high praise.
It really is. And this evaluation is tethered to what the text describes as a fundamental shift in the culture of Singapore, which is the historic seat of the Nepalese government.
So we need to look at what this new culture actually looks like in practice, because the source points heavily to Balen Shah's aggressive urban renewal campaigns, specifically the physical clearing of encroached public land to build parks.
Right, the bulldozers.
The bulldozers.
Mm-hmm.
And the text emphasizes a very crucial detail here.
Mm-hmm.
This land is being cleared regardless of who is occupying it. It doesn't matter if the public land was swallowed up by wealthy elites building illegal extensions, or if it was informal settlements built by the poor.
And that detail is the physical manifestation of the rule of law the author is advocating for. In this framework, the rule of law cannot simply exist as text in a constitution.
It can't just be words on paper.
Exactly. It has to be a physical, undeniable force in the environment. So the text introduces the concept of the web of land mafias who exploit public space to collect hafta.
Hafta, right?
Yeah, hafta is a system of wetly protection money or illegal rent extracted from vulnerable populations.
So the distinction the text makes here is really critical, because the author does acknowledge genuine squatters. They refer to them as sukumbasi.
Right.
And the text states they require proper humane management. But the primary target is the mafia infrastructure that hides behind the plight of the poor to consolidate power and illicit wealth.
Yeah, they use the poor as a human shield, essentially.
Right. And treating the issue of encroached land is like treating a systemic disease. Like a weak state is an invisible disease, right? But a mafia-run slum built on public land is a visible symptom.
That's a really good way to put it.
So by bringing in the bulldozers to reclaim a park, the government is treating the visible symptom to prove to the entire populace that the invisible medicine, which is state authority and the rule of law, actually exists and is functioning.
Yes. It serves as a public performance of uncompromising authority. When the state dismantles a network extracting hafta, it sends a shockwave through the entire political ecosystem.
Everyone notices.
Everyone. And the author insists this standard must be universal. True rule of law must equally pursue corrupt former prime ministers, elite insiders manipulating the stock market, and low-level extortionists. The law must be an indiscriminate force of nature.
But as you can imagine, deploying heavy machinery to clear neighborhoods, even if they are deemed illegal, it triggers massive social friction and huge political backlash. So the author dedicates a significant portion of the text to lambasting those who oppose this aggressive urban renewal. They create this stark binary between the forces of progress and the defenders of a corrupt status quo.
And the rhetoric used against these critics is exceptionally severe. I mean, the text accuses opponents of performing stunts on social media designed merely to mimic advocacy for the poor.
Yeah, they really go after them.
They do. The author's underlying argument is that these critics have a vested interest in the old system. By opposing the clearing of slums and the breaking of mafias, the text claims these individuals are actively opposing an ujjwal bhavisha, which means a bright future for the nation.
And the author weaponizes some incredibly visceral language against specific politicians here, most notably against Harka Sampang, who is the mayor of Dharan.
Yeah, this part was striking.
It really was. The text goes far beyond, simple policy disagreement. They label him a foreign agent who lacks both wisdom and integrity.
Which is a heavy accusation.
Very heavy. And it even utilizes regional insults. It points out that he's referred to as Ulu Kapatha, which means a fool, in the Madhesh region, and a Haralafek Swanth, meaning a simpleton or a charlatan, in the hills.
Which tells us a lot, right? When a geopolitical analysis descends into highlighting regional insults, it signifies a profound ideological polarization.
It's not just a debate anymore.
Exactly. The author is not engaging in a polite debate about urban planning. They are fighting an existential battle over the definition of national maturity. The text explicitly argues that age or youth alone does not equate to leadership.
Right.
They say growing old alone is not enough. Integrity is equally important, just as youth does not automatically confer wisdom.
So to you listening, I think this intense vitriol tells you everything you need to know about the current political climate the author is navigating. For the author, utilizing social justice rhetoric to defend illegal settlements is an act of national sabotage.
Because that's exactly how they see it.
They believe that if the state bends to these protests, the entire project of establishing the rule of law just collapses, and the nation remains trapped in poverty. Compromise is not viewed as a democratic necessity here. It is viewed as a fatal weakness.
Yeah, compromise is failure. But to justify this uncompromising stance, the author realizes they need more than just the recent example of Uttar Pradesh.
Right, UP is too recent.
Exactly. They need a historical masterclass. They need a proven long-term playbook that demonstrates exactly what happens when a government forces aesthetic and social order onto a chaotic population.
And that leads the text to the defining case study of this deep dive, Lee Kuan Yew's transformation of Singapore.
Yes.
So the text focuses on Lee Kuan Yew, or LKY, and his very first initiative upon becoming prime minister. Now, when you take over a fragile, impoverished, newly independent nation, you might assume step one is securing the borders.
Or nationalizing banks, sure.
Right, big macroeconomic stuff. But the source highlights that LKY's initial focus was entirely aesthetic. It was beautifying the road from the airport to the prime minister's office.
Which sounds crazy, right?
It sounds so superficial.
It does. Planting trees and manicuring lawns while your population faces double-digit unemployment seems deeply counterintuitive. But the text unpacks the profound psychological and macroeconomic calculation behind this move.
Okay, lay it out for us.
So, in 1965, Singapore was a tiny island devoid of any natural resources. They had no oil, no massive agricultural tracts, no vast domestic market. They had absolutely nothing to sell the world except their own competence.
Oh, wow.
Right. So if your entire economic survival depends on convincing foreign investors to inject capital into your country, you have to manage their psychology from the exact moment they step off the airplane.
It's like the ultimate application of the dress for the job you want philosophy, but scaled up to a sovereign nation.
That is a perfect way to phrase it. And the author explicitly contrasts this aesthetic discipline with Nepal's current state. The text argues that a major city devoid of parks and green spaces becomes a breeding ground for psychological distress and societal decay.
So aesthetics aren't positioned as a luxury reserved for wealthy nations.
No, not at all. They are positioned as the fundamental prerequisite for wealth creation.
Because, think about it, a foreign investor looking out the window of a taxi on the way from the airport, they are making subconscious calculations, right?
Constantly.
If they see chaotic traffic, sprawling slums, and crumbling infrastructure, they instantly assume the local government is weak. They assume regulations are unenforceable and their capital is at high risk.
Exactly.
But if they see perfectly paved roads, lush greenery, immaculate public spaces, they assume the state possesses discipline, authority, and longevity. The trees aren't just pretty, they are a physical guarantee of the rule of law.
Yes, the trees are security, but that aesthetic control was just the visible surface of a much deeper, more radical societal overhaul.
Oh yeah, it goes so much deeper.
It really does. The text relies heavily on LKY's year 2000 autobiography, From Third World to First, and treats it almost like an operational manual. And to appreciate the extremity of the policies LKY implemented, you really have to understand the sheer desperation of Singapore's starting position in 1965.
Which the source paints as a remarkably grim picture.
Very grim. The GDP per capita was hovering around a mere $500.
Wow.
They were battling malaria outbreaks, housing was incredibly scarce, leading to vast squatter settlements, and they were dealing with the immediate, violent aftermath of being expelled from Malaysia.
That's right, they were expelled.
Yes, which resulted in severe racial tensions among a diverse population living on this vulnerable little island, surrounded by much larger, potentially hostile neighbors.
So when faced with imminent collapse like that, LKY discarded ideological purity entirely. The text notes he wasn't interested in conforming to Western liberal democratic ideals, nor was he bound by strict socialist dogma or pure free market capitalism.
I didn't care about the labels.
No. He embraced a philosophy of ruthless pragmatism. He only cared about mechanisms that produced measurable results.
Right. And let's look at how that pragmatism functioned mechanically, starting with corruption. So, LKY demanded an absolute meritocracy, but he knew that demanding integrity from underpaid officials was mathematically doomed to fail.
Yeah. Human nature just gets in the way.
Exactly. So the text highlights a highly controversial yet highly effective mechanism. He drastically raised the salaries of civil servants and government ministers.
Oh, this is such a fascinating psychological flip. Because usually citizens despise the idea of politicians enriching themselves with taxpayer money.
Oh, they hate it.
Right. But LKY argued that if you want world-class governance, you must pay your ministers what top-tier corporate executives earn in the private sector.
Because if a minister is paid a fraction of their market value, the inherent friction of daily life practically incentivizes bribery and embezzlement just to maintain their social standing.
Yeah, it's just so much easier to take a bribe if you're struggling.
Exactly. So by paying massive salaries, he removed the financial desperation that breeds low-level corruption.
And the author of this blog seems to suggest that Nepal needs to study this exact lever, right? Pay the politicians exorbitant, transparent salaries in order to dismantle the sprawling, hidden networks of illicit wealth extraction.
Yeah, that's exactly what they're saying. And you couple that wealth with the creation of the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau, the CPI, which was an agency granted terrifyingly broad powers to investigate anyone, regardless of rank, and you engineer a clean state.
But, and this is a big but, that clean state required a significant sacrifice of civil liberties.
Huge sacrifices.
The text does not shy away from the heavy-handed tactics used to secure political dominance. While building this efficient bureaucracy, LKY systematically suppressed political opposition and exerted tight control over the media.
Yeah, they didn't tolerate dissent.
No, and the source specifically mentions the utilization of the Internal Security Act, the ISA.
Right. The ISA allowed the state to detain individuals without trial if they were suspected of subversion, communist sympathies, or inciting racial violence.
Attainment without trial, that's intense.
It is. You essentially bypass the slow, messy process of the judicial system entirely to neutralize threats instantly.
Which introduces the concept of performance legitimacy.
Yes, performance legitimacy is key here. LKY argued that introducing unrestricted, noisy, Western-style democracy into a fragile, multiracial society sitting on a geopolitical fault line would guarantee catastrophic bloodshed.
Because everyone would just fight for their own faction.
Exactly. He frequently pointed to the ethnic conflicts in Sri Lanka and Lebanon as evidence of what happens when weak states prioritize democratic theory over social order.
So the bargain offered to the citizens of Singapore was incredibly stark. It was basically surrender your right to protest, accept severe limits on political expression, and an aggressive internal security apparatus.
And in return?
And in return, the state will guarantee your physical safety, eradicate poverty, and engineer unprecedented economic growth.
And because the government consistently delivered on that promise, the populace largely accepted the bargain. The author of the blog clearly views this brand of performance legitimacy as the only viable path for Nepal.
It's the only way out, in their eyes.
Right. The text's earlier demand to abandon imported democracy aligns perfectly with LKY's rejection of Western political norms in favor of a hyper-disciplined, results-oriented autocracy.
So with political opposition neutralized and the bureaucracy functioning like a well-oiled machine, LKY turned his attention to the economy. And the transformation detailed in the source is dizzying.
Truly dizzying.
Singapore transitioned from a simple entrepot, which is a trading post that merely imports, stores, and re-exports goods without adding any real value, into a juggernaut of export-oriented industrialization.
Yeah, the state directed massive capital into world-class infrastructure. They built Changi Airport. They developed the Jurong Industrial Estate out of swampland.
Literal swampland.
Literal swamp. And they constructed what would become one of the busiest container ports on the planet. Simultaneously, they overhauled the education system to focus heavily on technical skills.
Right.
And they pragmatically mandated English as the primary working language. This allowed them to seamlessly integrate with global markets while still preserving ethnic mother tongues at home.
But the most profound economic and social mechanism they deployed involved where the citizens actually slept at night.
Yes, housing.
The text focuses heavily on the Housing and Development Board, the HDB. In the 1960s, a huge portion of the population lived in slums. The HDB essentially bulldozed those informal settlements, just like what's happening in Kathmandu.
Right.
And they rapidly constructed massive state-owned public housing blocks. Today, the source notes that between 80 to 90% of Singaporeans live in these HDB flats.
Which is an astonishing percentage.
Yeah.
And to fund this astronomical construction effort without bankrupting the state, LKY utilized the Central Provident Fund, the CPF.
What's the CPF?
So the CPF was a mandatory state-managed forced savings scheme. A significant percentage of every worker's paycheck was automatically deducted and placed into this fund.
Automatically.
Yeah, no choice in the matter. And the government then used those funds to finance the construction of the HDB flats.
Wow.
But here's the clever part. They allowed citizens to use their CPF savings to purchase 99-year leases on those very same apartments.
Oh, that is clever. It's like, think about the mechanics of a startup company. If you hire someone and just pay them a flat salary, they might work hard, but they don't necessarily care if the company survives long term.
Right. They just want their paycheck.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if you give that employee equity, if you give them stock options, their personal wealth is suddenly inextricably tied to the success of the entire enterprise. They become a stakeholder.
Yeah.
They aren't going to steal office supplies or sabotage the servers because they would be destroying their own net worth.
That is the exact psychological mechanism LKY applied to a nation of millions. By forcing savings and subsidizing homeownership, he transformed an impoverished transient population into a nation of property owners.
And the text highlights that LKY viewed this stakeholder society as the ultimate bulwark against communism, right?
Yes. A citizen who owns a rapidly appreciating asset in a stable economy is mathematically disincentivized from joining a violent revolution to overthrow the government.
They have too much to lose. And this connects flawlessly back to the author's praise for Balen Shah in Kathmandu.
It does.
When the author demands the clearing of the Sukumbasi slums along the riverbanks, they aren't just advocating for prettier views. They are looking at the HDB playbook. They are suggesting that dismantling slums and forcing people into regulated, state-sanctioned housing is the necessary pain required to turn marginalized populations into invested shareholders of the nation.
Right. However, LKY understood that managing the economy and housing was insufficient if the underlying social fabric was volatile.
Because it was a very diverse place.
Very diverse. Singapore's demographic makeup, predominantly Chinese, with significant Malay and Indian minorities, was a persistent source of anxiety. So the text outlines the intense, granular social engineering LKY deployed to prevent the country from fracturing along ethnic lines.
Yeah, they institutionalized the CMIO model, which categorized the population into Chinese, Malay, Indian, and others. And they used this categorization to enforce the ethnic integration policy, or EIP.
And the EIP wasn't just a vague suggestion to get along.
Well,
The state literally set strict ethnic quotas for every single HDB apartment block and neighborhood.
the mechanics of the EIP are astonishing to me because it mathematically guaranteed that no single ethnicity could dominate a specific housing estate.
Right.
If the quota for Chinese families in a specific building was reached, a Chinese owner could only sell their apartment to a non-Chinese buyer.
Yeah, they forcefully prevented enclaves.
It aggressively, legally dismantled the possibility of racial enclaves forming. You were forced to share elevators, parks, and schools with people of different backgrounds, engineering social cohesion through forced proximity.
And the social engineering extended into national defense, too. The text details the implementation of compulsory military conscription, building a highly advanced armed forces guided by the poisonous shrimp doctrine.
The poisonous shrimp doctrine. I love that name.
It's very evocative. It's a fascinating concept of asymmetric deterrence. Singapore knew it could never build an army large enough to conquer its massive neighbors like Malaysia or Indonesia. They couldn't be a whale.
Right.
But they refused to be a harmless minnow. The doctrine dictated that they would arm themselves so heavily and train so fiercely that while a larger predator might be able to swallow them, the act of digestion would prove fatal.
The cost of invading Singapore would simply be too catastrophic to contemplate.
Exactly. And they applied that same logic of self-reliance to their water supply.
Oh, right. The water.
They invested heavily in recycling wastewater into what they call new water, ensuring they could never be held hostage by a neighbor threatening to cut off their pipelines.
So they are securing everything. But the social engineering didn't stop at macro survival. It filtered down to the absolute minutia of daily human behavior.
Down to the smallest detail.
The text notes the implementation of draconian behavioral laws. Vandalism was punishable by judicial caning, drug trafficking carried a mandatory death penalty, and perhaps most famously in the West, they banned the importation and sale of chewing gum.
Yeah, the chewing gum ban.
Simply to prevent it from jamming the sensors on their new subway doors and littering the pristine streets.
And LKY leveraged what the text refers to as kiasu culture.
Kiasu.
Right, it's a Hokkien term essentially translating to a paralyzing fear of losing out or falling behind. He channeled that cultural anxiety into an engine for relentless national productivity. He deeply admired the hierarchical, discipline-focused tenets of Confucianism,
While openly criticizing the West.
Yes, he openly criticized Western societies for what he viewed as permissive, chaotic decadence that elevated individual rights over collective survival.
But the most profound and controversial display of this willingness to manipulate society involved their demographic livers. The source details how, in the early days, the government was terrified that a population boom would overwhelm their fragile economy.
They thought they'd run out of resources.
Right, so they launched an aggressive Stop at Two campaign, heavily disincentivizing families from having a third child through tax penalties and reduced access to schools.
But then the economy exploded.
Yes. Women entered the workforce in massive numbers, and fertility rates plummeted. So instead of doubling down on a failing policy, the government executed a whiplash-inducing reversal.
A total 180.
Suddenly, the state is offering massive baby bonuses. They even introduce highly controversial, essentially eugenic schemes like the Graduate Mother Scheme, offering tax relief and school admission privileges specifically to university-educated women who chose to have more children, fearing a dilution of the national intellect.
That is just wild.
It is. How does this highlight the author's ultimate point about pragmatism? It seems like if a policy stopped working, LKY just ruthlessly abandoned it. Is that the agility the author wants for Nepal?
Absolutely. This demographic whiplash perfectly encapsulates the agility of the Singaporean model. LKY treated state policies exactly like levers on a massive machine. If you pull a lever and it stops producing the desired outcome, you don't debate the morality of the lever.
You just pull a different one.
You ruthlessly abandon it and pull a different one. And the author of the blog looks at the endless, stagnant ideological debates in Nepal's parliament and yearns for that exact mechanical agility.
They want that power.
They believe Nepal is facing such acute geopolitical and economic vulnerabilities that it can no longer afford the luxury of democratic gridlock. They want a state powerful enough to dictate housing, manipulate demographics, and enforce aesthetics without being paralyzed by social media outrage or endless court injunctions.
However, the source material is surprisingly candid about the massive trade-offs inherent in this model.
Yeah, it doesn't hide the flaws.
Achieving first-world status at breakneck speed required enduring significant systemic costs.
It did. The text lists several profound criticisms of the Singapore model. First, despite effectively eradicating absolute grinding poverty, the system generated persistent, staggering wealth inequality.
Right.
The gap between the ultra-rich elite and the working-class citizens is immense. The economic engine also became deeply addicted to low-wage foreign labor to perform the menial construction and service jobs, creating a tiered society and ongoing social friction.
What of the political side?
Well, a political system specifically designed to limit contestation and enforce consensus eventually begins to stifle organic creativity. When an entire population is educated to follow the rules impeccably and fear the consequences of failure, it can hinder the disruptive innovation required in the modern tech economy.
Right, because you're scared to step out of line. And crucially, the text acknowledges that the younger generations, those who inherited the wealth but didn't live through the existential terror of 1965, find this intense paternalism increasingly suffocating.
They feel trapped?
They chafe under a state that acts like a strict, omnipresent parent. Plus, despite all the demographic lever pulling, they are still facing a rapidly aging population and unsustainably low birth rates.
Yeah. But it's important to note, the author doesn't include these criticisms to undermine their own argument.
No.
No, they include them to fortify it. The text is making the case that true nation-building is not a utopian fantasy where everyone gets exactly what they want. It is a brutal exercise in choosing which problems you are willing to live with.
Picking your poison.
Exactly. LKY's institutions-first approach, which actively avoided creating a welfare dependency, forged a society that is undeniably wealthy, safe, and efficient, but it is also highly constrained and highly engineered.
Which brings us back to the streets of Kathmandu and the ultimate underlying question the author is forcing you to confront.
Yeah.
If you, listening right now, if you were handed a ballot tomorrow And on that ballot was a Faustian bargain.
Okay.
You must permanently surrender a significant portion of your political freedom. You must accept a government that can legally dictate where you live, what media you consume, and aggressively police your daily behavior.
That's a tough pill to swallow.
It is. But in exchange, that government guarantees the total eradication of extreme poverty, the construction of world-class infrastructure, elite educational systems, and the ability to walk down perfectly clean, perfectly safe streets at 3 in the morning without a single ounce of fear. Do you sign that contract?
The author of the source material looks at the current trajectory of Nepal, looks at the poverty and the political stagnation, and aggressively checks the yes box on that contract.
Yes, they do.
They believe the trade-off is not just acceptable, it is an absolute moral imperative for survival.
The blog post concludes with a deep, almost defiant surge of optimism, focused entirely on Balen Shah. It circles back to the foundational premise. A beautiful capital is the mandatory prerequisite to building a prosperous nation.
Right.
But it includes a very sharp, telling observation, noting that not every Nepali fully shares the desire to build the country.
And that phrase perfectly encapsulates the author's profound frustration with the consensus-building nature of Nepal's current democratic process. The author is entirely convinced that Nepal requires disciplined governance, unyielding integrity, and visionary long-term planning, all of which are infinitely more valuable than arguing over imported political slogans.
So, synthesizing this massive geopolitical roadmap, the author's logic flows like this. They utilize the recent history of Uttar Pradesh to prove that incredibly rapid macro-level transformation is possible within a single decade if a state prioritizes unyielding law and order above all else.
Yep, that's step one.
Then, they deploy Lee Kuan Yew's Singapore as the granular, step-by-step operational blueprint. Establish the rule of law, eradicate corruption through high salaries and terrifying enforcement, physically beautify the environment to attract capital, and utilize heavy-handed social engineering to force domestic stability.
And ultimately, they position Balen Shah as the precise vessel required to execute this vision. The author believes that if Balen Shah can successfully push through his uncompromising mission to physically clean up Kathmandu and break the land mafias, it will serve as the catalytic precedent needed to take the speed of UP, apply the blueprint of LKY, and radically transform the entire nation of Nepal.
It is a breathtakingly ambitious, intensely controversial argument.
It really is.
We want to thank you for joining us on this exhaustive journey through the mechanics of raw political power, the psychology of urban planning, and the often brutal realities required to construct a nation from the ground up.
It's a text that forces you to examine the foundational mechanics of the society you live in and question what sacrifices are required to maintain it.
It truly does. And before we part ways, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought that builds on everything we've unpacked today.
All right.
The source relentlessly argues that a beautiful city and the absolute uncompromising rule of law are the non-negotiable foundations of a prosperous nation. But if a society actively chooses to empower a government with the sweeping, unquestioned authority required to rapidly bulldoze neighborhoods, enforce strict social behaviors, and prioritize aesthetic order over noisy political debate, who exactly gets to define what beautiful means?
That's the million-dollar question.
And more importantly, once you hand a state that kind of immense, pragmatic, and heavily armed power to build your city, how do you ensure they ever give it back? Think about that. Until next time.